What happens when an unbreakable force meets an immovable object? Tonight, you'll witness a fight that changed everything on a plantation where hope seemed impossible. This is a story of resistance, dignity, and the moment when one man's courage ignited a flame that would never be extinguished. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. The humid Georgia air hung thick like a suffocating blanket over Whitmore Plantation in the summer of 1857. Cicadas screamed their endless chorus, while Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, casting eerie shadows across the compound. The smell of sweat, fear, and desperation permeated every corner of this place where human dignity came to die. In the center of the slave quarters stood a circle of packed earth, worn smooth by countless boots and stained dark with blood and tears. This wasn't just any patch of ground. This was the arena where Master Whitmore's twisted entertainment played out every time new property arrived at his plantation. The flickering light of oil lanterns created dancing shadows on the weathered faces of nearly 200 enslaved souls who had been forced to gather around the circle. Their eyes held the hollow look of people who had witnessed this ritual too many times before. Some clutched their children closer, whispering prayers that tonight might be different. Others simply stared at the ground, unable to bear watching another spirit get crushed. At the edge of the circle stood Tobias the Hammer Johnson, a mountain of a man whose massive frame cast an imposing shadow across the arena. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing nearly 250 pounds of pure muscle, Tobias was a sight that struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest men. His dark skin bore the scars of countless battles, some from his days as a field hand, others from the brutal fights he'd been forced into as Master Whitmore's champion. Tobias's hands, large enough to crush a man's skull, hung loosely at his sides as he surveyed the crowd with dead eyes. Those hands had broken bones, shattered dreams, and extinguished hope more times than he cared to remember. His face, once handsome and full of life, now resembled a mask carved from stone. Emotionless, calculating, and terrifyingly efficient. "Ladies and gentlemen," Master Whitmore's voice boomed across the courtyard as he stepped onto a makeshift platform constructed from old wooden crates. At 52 years old, Jeremiah Whitmore was a man who had built his fortune on the backs of human misery. His pale skin, protected from the Georgia sun by expensive hats and long sleeves, contrasted sharply with his cold blue eyes that seemed to find pleasure in others' pain. Beside him stood his son, Marcus, a 25-year-old replica of his father's cruelty but lacking the older man's cunning. Marcus fidgeted with excitement, his hands clasped behind his back as he anticipated the violence to come. "Tonight, we welcome 12 new additions to our family," Whitmore continued, his voice dripping with false warmth. "And as is our tradition, they must be properly introduced to our ways." The crowd of enslaved people shifted uncomfortably. They knew what introduction meant. It meant watching their new brothers and sisters get beaten into submission by Tobias, the man who had once been one of them, but had been transformed into something else entirely, a weapon wielded by their oppressor. Tobias remembered his first night on this plantation 15 years ago. He had been 22 then, fresh from a smaller farm in South Carolina, where he had worked alongside his father and younger brother. That night, he had faced the previous champion, a man named Samuel, who had held the position for 8 years. Tobias had fought with everything he had, driven by rage and the desperate hope that victory might earn him some small measure of respect or better treatment. He had won that fight, breaking Samuel's ribs and leaving him unconscious in the dirt. But victory had come with a price he hadn't understood at the time. With each subsequent fight, each new arrival he was forced to defeat, a piece of his soul had died. The other enslaved people began to fear him, to see him as an extension of their master's will rather than one of their own. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Tobias ate alone, slept alone, and carried the weight of his actions in solitude. He had become exactly what Master Whitmore wanted, a symbol of hopelessness, proof that resistance was futile, that even the strongest among them could be broken and turned against their own people. "Bring forth the first challenger," Whitmore commanded, clapping his hands together with glee. From the shadows emerged Overseer Hayes, a wiry man with a face like a ferret and a disposition twice as nasty. He dragged forward a young man who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. The boy's name was Samuel, named after the previous champion Tobias had defeated years ago, and he trembled as he was shoved into the circle. Samuel was tall but thin, his muscles not yet fully developed. His eyes darted around the crowd, searching for a friendly face, some sign of hope or encouragement. Instead, he found only pity and resignation. The older enslaved people had learned long ago that cheering for the challengers only brought punishment upon themselves. "Please," Samuel whispered as Tobias approached him, "I don't want to fight. I just want to work and keep my head down." Tobias felt something twist in his chest, a feeling he had tried to bury for years. This boy reminded him of his younger brother, David, who had been sold to a different plantation when their previous master fell into debt. For just a moment, Tobias saw David's face looking back at him, pleading for mercy that Tobias was not allowed to give. "I'm sorry," Tobias said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the lanterns. "But if I don't do this, they'll make it worse for both of us." The fight was over in less than 2 minutes. Samuel tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Tobias caught him easily, delivering a single devastating blow to the solar plexus that dropped the young man to his knees, gasping for air. A second punch to the jaw sent Samuel sprawling unconscious in the dirt. The crowd watched in silence as Overseer Hayes dragged Samuel's limp form away. 1 down, 11 to go. The next challenger was an older man named Moses, perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and hands calloused from decades of hard labor. He had more experience than Samuel, more understanding of what he was facing. Moses didn't plead or try to run. Instead, he raised his fists and prepared to fight with whatever dignity he could muster. "You don't have to do this," Moses said to Tobias as they circled each other. "We're brothers, you and I. We share the same chains, the same pain." "No," Tobias replied, his voice hollow. "I stopped being your brother a long time ago." Moses lasted longer than Samuel, nearly 5 minutes, but the outcome was inevitable. Tobias's superior size, strength, and experience overwhelmed the older man's courage and determination. When Moses finally fell, blood trickling from his split lip, he looked up at Tobias with eyes full of disappointment rather than anger. "What have they turned you into?" Moses whispered before losing consciousness. The question hit Tobias like a physical blow. He had asked himself the same thing countless times over the years, usually in the dark hours before dawn, when sleep eluded him, and guilt gnawed at his soul like a hungry rat. One by one, the challengers came forward. A teenage boy who cried for his mother, a middle-aged field hand who fought with desperate fury, a young father who begged Tobias to think of his own family. Each fight ended the same way, with another broken body being dragged from the circle and another piece of Tobias's humanity dying. By the time the 10th challenger fell, the crowd had grown restless. Some of the children were crying, their mothers trying to comfort them while fighting back their own tears. The men stood with clenched fists and burning eyes, their anger barely contained. Master Whitmore seemed to sense the mood shift and gestured for more guards to position themselves around the perimeter. "2 more," Whitmore announced gleefully, "and then we can all retire for the evening, secure in the knowledge that our new family members understand their place in our little community." The 11th challenger was a woman, something that hadn't happened in years. Her name was Ruth, and she was perhaps 30 years old, with strong shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. She had been separated from her husband and children when their previous master died and his estate was liquidated. The pain of that loss burned in her eyes like a forge fire. "I won't fight a woman," Tobias said, turning toward Master Whitmore. "This isn't right." Whitmore's face darkened with anger. "You'll fight whoever I tell you to fight, boy. Or would you prefer I have Hayes give you a reminder of your place?" Overseer Hayes stepped forward, his hand resting on the coiled whip at his belt. Tobias had felt that whip before. Everyone on the plantation had. The scars on his back were a permanent reminder of what happened to those who defied their masters. Ruth stepped closer to Tobias, her voice low and urgent. "Fight me," she said, "but don't break me. Let me keep my dignity, even in defeat." Tobias looked into her eyes and saw something he hadn't seen in years, understanding. Ruth knew what position he was in, knew the impossible choice he faced. She wasn't asking him to let her win. She was asking him to let her lose with honor. The fight was carefully choreographed, a dance of violence that looked real to the watching crowd, but allowed Ruth to maintain her dignity. Tobias pulled his punches, making each blow look devastating while ensuring they caused minimal actual damage. Ruth played her part perfectly, selling each impact and finally allowing herself to be knocked unconscious by a gentle tap to the temple. As Ruth was carried away, winking at Tobias when no one else could see, he felt something stir within him that had been dormant for years. It was a small spark, barely noticeable, but it was there. The memory of who he used to be before this place had twisted him into something unrecognizable. And now, Master Whitmore announced, his voice rising with excitement, our final challenger of the evening. From the shadows stepped a man who immediately commanded attention. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build that spoke of both strength and agility. His dark skin seemed to absorb the lantern light, making him appear almost ethereal in the flickering glow, but it was his eyes that truly set him apart. Those eyes held no fear, no resignation, no desperate hope for mercy. Instead, they burned with a quiet intensity that made even Tobias take a step back. This man had seen suffering. That much was clear from the scars that crisscrossed his arms and chest, but he had not been broken by it. If anything, the pain seemed to have forged him into something harder, more determined. "What's your name?" Tobias asked as the man entered the circle. "Ezekiel," the man replied, his voice deep and steady. "Ezekiel Freeman." "Freeman?" Tobias couldn't hide his surprise. "That's not a slave name." "No," Ezekiel said simply. "It's not." The implications of that statement sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. A free man? How had he ended up here? The answer came from Master Whitmore himself, who seemed delighted to share the story. Mr. Freeman here was traveling through our fair state when he made the unfortunate decision to help some runaway property reach the Underground Railroad, Whitmore explained. The authorities were kind enough to deliver him to me as compensation for my losses. Isn't that right, Freeman? Ezekiel said nothing, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Tobias caught the gesture and understood immediately. This man had been free, had chosen to risk everything to help others escape the very hell that Tobias had been trapped in his entire life. And now he was here, facing the same fate as everyone else. "I've heard about you," Ezekiel said quietly, his eyes never leaving Tobias's face. "They call you the Hammer. They say you've never lost a fight." "That's right," Tobias replied, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "They also say you used to be one of us, before you became one of them." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Tobias felt the eyes of every enslaved person in the crowd boring into him, waiting to see how he would respond. Some looked at him with hatred, others with pity, but all of them were watching to see if any trace of the man he used to be still existed. "I do what I have to do to survive," Tobias said finally. "No," Ezekiel replied, beginning to circle slowly around the edge of the fighting area. "You do what they've trained you to do. There's a difference." As the two men faced each other in the flickering lantern light, something electric seemed to charge the air around them. This wasn't going to be like the other fights. Everyone could sense it. The guards, the masters, the enslaved people watching from the shadows. This was going to be something different, something that would be remembered long after the lanterns were extinguished and the crowd dispersed. For the first time in 15 years, Tobias felt a flutter of uncertainty in his chest. Not fear. He had long ago forgotten how to feel fear for his own safety, but something else, something that felt almost like anticipation. The circle seemed to shrink as the two men began their deadly dance. Tobias had fought hundreds of battles in this very spot, but something about this moment felt different. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, and even the ever-present chorus of cicadas had fallen silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Ezekiel moved with a fluid grace that immediately caught Tobias's attention. Most of the men he fought were either terrified novices or aging field hands whose bodies had been broken by years of brutal labor. But Ezekiel moved like a predator, balanced, controlled, and utterly confident in his own abilities. "You don't have to do this," Tobias said, though he knew the words were meaningless. They both understood that there was no choice here, no escape from the twisted theater that Master Whitmore had orchestrated. "Yes, I do," Ezekiel replied, his voice calm and steady, "but not for the reasons you think." Before Tobias could ask what he meant, Ezekiel struck. The punch came faster than Tobias had expected, a lightning-quick jab aimed at his solar plexus. Tobias managed to twist away at the last second, the blow glancing off his ribs instead of landing with full force. Even so, the impact sent a shock of pain through his body that he hadn't felt in years. The crowd gasped. In 15 years of fighting, no one had ever landed the first blow on Tobias. Not once. "Impossible," Master Whitmore muttered from his platform, leaning forward with sudden interest. Tobias recovered quickly, his years of experience taking over. He launched a devastating right cross toward Ezekiel's jaw, the same punch that had ended dozens of fights before. But Ezekiel wasn't there when the blow arrived. He had slipped to the side with minimal movement, making Tobias's massive fist whistle harmlessly through empty air. The miss threw Tobias off balance, and Ezekiel capitalized immediately. A sharp uppercut caught Tobias under the chin, snapping his head back and sending stars exploding across his vision. Before he could recover, a second punch, this one to his kidney, sent waves of agony through his lower back. For the first time in 15 years, Tobias staggered. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Children who had been crying moments before now watched with wide eyes. Men who had given up hope began to straighten their shoulders. Women who had seen their own sons and husbands broken in this very circle clutched each other's hands and dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, something was different about tonight. "How?" Tobias gasped, shaking his head to clear the ringing in his ears. "I had a good teacher," Ezekiel replied, circling again. "A man named Joshua who fought in bare-knuckle matches up north before he joined the Underground Railroad. He taught me that size and strength mean nothing if you can't hit what you're aiming at." Tobias wiped blood from his split lip, his own blood, something he hadn't seen in years. The metallic taste filled his mouth, but instead of discouraging him, it seemed to awaken something primal and fierce. This was what fighting was supposed to feel like, not the one-sided beatings he had been delivering for years, but a real contest between equals. "Good," Tobias said, raising his fists again. "I was getting tired of fighting children." What followed was unlike anything the plantation had ever witnessed. The two men moved around the circle like gladiators, each seeking an advantage, each testing the other's defenses. Tobias's raw power was matched by Ezekiel's speed and technique. When Tobias threw a haymaker that could have decapitated a smaller man, Ezekiel ducked under it and responded with a combination of body shots that left Tobias gasping. When Ezekiel tried to use his footwork to stay on the outside, Tobias cut off the ring and forced him into close quarters, where his size advantage could come into play. The sound of flesh striking flesh echoed across the courtyard like gunshots. Both men were bleeding now, Tobias from cuts above both eyes and a split lip, Ezekiel from a gash on his cheek and what looked like a broken nose. But neither man showed any sign of backing down. "Why are you doing this?" Tobias demanded during a brief clinch, his voice barely audible over the crowd's growing excitement. "You could have just gone down easy like the others, made it simple for both of us." "Because," Ezekiel replied, breaking free and landing a sharp hook to Tobias's ribs, "someone needs to remind you who you really are." The words hit Tobias harder than any physical blow. For just a moment his guard dropped, and Ezekiel took advantage. A perfectly timed right cross caught Tobias flush on the jaw, sending him stumbling backward toward the edge of the circle. The crowd was on its feet now, their earlier resignation replaced by something that had been absent from this place for far too long: hope. They weren't cheering. That would have brought swift punishment from the guards. But their silence was electric with possibility. Master Whitmore was no longer smiling. His face had gone pale, and his hands gripped the edge of his platform so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tobias was supposed to be unbeatable, a symbol of the futility of resistance. If he lost, or even if he struggled, it would send a message that Whitmore couldn't afford to have spread through his plantation. "Finish him!" Whitmore shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Finish him now!" But Tobias wasn't listening to his master anymore. For the first time in 15 years, he was fighting for himself rather than for someone else's entertainment. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Ezekiel pressed his advantage, landing a series of quick jabs that kept Tobias off balance. But the bigger man's conditioning was extraordinary, a product of years of hard labor and constant training. He absorbed the punishment and kept coming forward looking for an opening. That opening came when Ezekiel, perhaps overconfident from his early success, tried to end the fight with a dramatic overhand right. It was a powerful punch, but it left him exposed for just a fraction of a second. Tobias slipped the blow and countered with a devastating left hook that caught Ezekiel in the ribs. The sound of the impact was sickening, like a tree branch snapping in a storm. Ezekiel doubled over, gasping for air, and Tobias followed up with an uppercut that lifted the smaller man off his feet and sent him crashing to the ground. For a moment, it looked like the fight was over. Ezekiel lay motionless in the dirt, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. The crowd's brief moment of hope seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. Master Whitmore began to smile again, relief washing over his features. But then Ezekiel moved. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up to his hands and knees. Blood dripped from his face onto the packed earth, but his eyes, those burning, defiant eyes, never lost their fire. "Stay down," Tobias said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice. "Please, just stay down." Ezekiel looked up at him, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with blood but steady with conviction. "I can't do that. Too many people are watching. Too many people need to see that we don't have to stay down." He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly, but somehow managing to raise his fists again. The crowd drew in a collective breath. Even the guards seemed transfixed by the display of raw courage. "You're going to get yourself killed," Tobias warned. "Maybe," Ezekiel admitted, "but I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees." The words echoed across the courtyard, and Tobias felt something crack inside his chest. Not a rib or a bone, but something deeper. Something that had been frozen for 15 years was beginning to thaw, and the sensation was both painful and liberating. They came together again, but this time the fight had a different quality. It was no longer about winning or losing, about entertainment or punishment. It had become something primal and pure, a test of will, a battle for the very soul of everyone watching. Ezekiel was clearly hurt, his movements slower and less precise than before, but he kept coming, kept throwing punches, kept refusing to surrender. And with each blow he absorbed, each time he got back up when he should have stayed down, something changed in the faces of the watching crowd. The fear was still there. It would always be there in a place like this. But it was no longer the only emotion visible. There was anger now and determination and something that looked almost like pride. They were watching one of their own refuse to be broken, and it was awakening something in them that had been dormant for far too long. Tobias found himself holding back, pulling his punches in ways he hadn't done since his fight with Ruth earlier that evening. But this was different. With Ruth, he had been showing mercy to someone who was clearly outmatched. With Ezekiel, he was beginning to realize that he didn't want to win. The thought was so foreign, so completely at odds with everything he had been conditioned to believe, that it nearly paralyzed him. For 15 years, his entire identity had been built around being unbeatable, around being the instrument of his master's will. What was he if not that? "I can see it in your eyes," Ezekiel said during another brief clinch, his breath hot against Tobias's ear. "You remember now, don't you? You remember who you used to be." "I don't know what you're talking about," Tobias replied, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, you do. You remember having a name that wasn't given to you by a white man. You remember having dreams that didn't involve breaking other people's spirits. You remember what it felt like to hope." Tobias tried to push Ezekiel away, but the smaller man held on, continuing to speak in that same urgent whisper. "I know about your brother David. I know about your father Samuel. I know about the woman you loved before they sold her to a plantation in Alabama. I know because I've been carrying messages for the Underground Railroad for 3 years. And your story, your real story, is one that people tell to give each other courage." The words hit Tobias like physical blows. David, Samuel, Maria. Names he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years, people he had forced himself to forget, because remembering them was too painful. "They're still alive," Ezekiel continued. "David is working on a farm in Pennsylvania, free soil. Your father died 2 years ago, but he died free. And Maria. Maria has been looking for you for 15 years. She never gave up hope that someday you'd find your way back to who you really are." Tobias felt his knees buckle, but it wasn't from any physical blow. The weight of 15 years of suppressed emotion, of buried hope and forgotten dreams, came crashing down on him all at once. He staggered backward, his hands dropping to his sides. "You're lying," he whispered. "I'm not," Ezekiel replied, lowering his own fists. "And deep down, you know I'm not." The crowd sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The two men stood facing each other in the center of the circle, but they were no longer fighting. Instead, they seemed to be having a conversation that was somehow more important than any physical contest. Master Whitmore sensed it too, and his face was now purple with rage. "What are you doing?" he screamed at Tobias. "Finish him! Finish him now, or I'll have you both whipped until there's nothing left but bone." But Tobias wasn't listening. For the first time in 15 years, he was remembering what it felt like to be human. The silence that followed Master Whitmore's threat was deafening. Even the night sounds of the Georgia countryside seemed to pause, as if the very earth was holding its breath. In that moment of crystalline clarity, Tobias felt the weight of 15 years of carefully constructed lies begin to crumble around him. He looked at Ezekiel, who stood bleeding but unbowed in the center of the circle, and saw something that terrified him more than any whip or chain ever could. He saw himself as he used to be, before the fear, before the compromise, before he had traded his soul for the illusion of safety. "Maria," Tobias whispered, the name feeling foreign on his lips after so many years of silence. "You really saw her?" Ezekiel nodded, his eyes never leaving Tobias's face. 3 months ago in Philadelphia. She's working as a seamstress, saving every penny she can to buy the freedom of enslaved people. She told me that if I ever met a man named Tobias Johnson, a man they called the Hammer, I should tell him that she never stopped believing in the man she fell in love with. The words shattered something inside Tobias's chest. He could see her face now, as clearly as if she were standing before him. Maria's laugh, bright and musical, even in the darkest times. Her hands, gentle but strong, tending to his wounds after a particularly brutal day in the fields. Her voice whispering promises of a future where they would be free to love each other without fear. "She said to tell you," Ezekiel continued, his voice growing stronger despite his injuries, "that the man who taught her to read by candlelight, who shared his meager rations with children who were hungrier than he was, who once risked a beating to help an old man who had collapsed in the fields, that man is still in there somewhere. She said to tell you that she's waiting for him to come home." Tobias felt tears streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the blood and dirt that covered his cheeks. Around the circle, he could see the faces of the enslaved people watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. They had seen him cry before. Everyone cried on the plantation, but never like this. Never with the raw, cathartic emotion of a man remembering who he used to be. "I can't," Tobias said, his voice breaking. "I've done too much, hurt too many people, they'll never forgive me." "Forgiveness isn't something you earn," Ezekiel replied. "It's something you accept. And redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about choosing who you want to be in the future." Master Whitmore's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Enough of this nonsense, Hayes. Bring the whips. If these animals won't fight, we'll give them something else to think about." Overseer Hayes stepped forward, his cruel face twisted into a grin of anticipation. Behind him, 3 more guards moved to surround the circle, their hands resting on the weapons at their belts. The crowd of enslaved people began to back away, recognizing the signs of impending violence. But something had changed in the air. Where before there had been resignation and fear, now there was something else. A tension that felt electric, dangerous, alive. The people weren't scattering as quickly as they usually did. Instead, they were watching Tobias, waiting to see what he would do. "You want to fight?" Tobias said, turning to face Master Whitmore. His voice was different now, deeper, more resonant, carrying an authority that hadn't been there moments before. "Then let's have one. But instead of turning back to Ezekiel, Tobias took a step toward the platform where his master stood. Then another, and another. "What are you doing?" Whitmore demanded, his voice rising with panic. "Get back in that circle. Fight the man you're supposed to fight." "No," Tobias said simply. "I'm done fighting for you." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. In the entire history of Whitmore Plantation, no enslaved person had ever directly defied the master so openly, so completely. The guards raised their weapons, but they seemed uncertain, looking to Whitmore for guidance. "You forget yourself, boy," Whitmore snarled, his face contorting with rage. "You forget what you are, what you owe me. I made you. I gave you purpose. Without me, you're nothing but another piece of property." "You're right," Tobias said, continuing his slow advance toward the platform. "You did make me. You took a man and turned him into a weapon. You took someone who believed in hope and justice and love, and you twisted him into something that could destroy those very things in others." He was close enough now that Whitmore had to look up to meet his eyes. The master's face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking as he reached for the pistol at his belt. "But here's what you never understood," Tobias continued, his voice carrying across the entire courtyard. "You can break a man's body. You can break his spirit. You can make him do terrible things to survive. But you can't destroy his soul, not unless he lets you, and I'm done letting you." Whitmore's hand closed around his pistol, but before he could draw it, Ezekiel was there. Moving with surprising speed for someone who had just endured such a beating, he vaulted onto the platform and grabbed the master's wrist, preventing him from pulling the weapon free. "I don't think so," Ezekiel said calmly. The guards rushed forward, but they found their path blocked by something unprecedented. The enslaved people of Whitmore Plantation, standing together, forming a human barrier between their oppressors and the two men on the platform. It started with Moses, the older man who had been one of the evening's early challengers. Despite his injuries, he stepped forward and planted himself directly in front of Overseer Hayes. Then Ruth joined him, her eyes blazing with defiance. Then Samuel, the young man who had been the first to fall, somehow found the strength to stand and add his body to the growing wall of resistance. One by one, two by two, then in groups, the enslaved people of the plantation moved forward, men and women, young and old, field hands and house servants, all of them united for the first time in a single moment of collective defiance. "Get back!" Hayes screamed, raising his whip. "Get back, or I'll flay the skin from every one of you." But they didn't move. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, facing down the instruments of their oppression with nothing but their shared humanity and their newfound courage. On the platform, Master Whitmore was struggling against Ezekiel's grip, his face purple with rage and exertion. "You're all dead!" he screamed at the crowd. "Every last one of you! I'll have you hanged! I'll have you burned alive!" "No," Tobias said, stepping up beside Ezekiel. "You won't." With one massive hand, he reached out and plucked the pistol from Whitmore's belt, as easily as taking candy from a child. The master's eyes went wide with terror as he found himself suddenly defenseless, facing two men who had every reason in the world to hate him. "Please," Whitmore whimpered, all his bluster evaporating in an instant. "Please, I have money. I can pay you. I can set you free. All of you. Just don't hurt me." Tobias looked down at the weapon in his hand, feeling its weight. It would be so easy. One squeeze of the trigger, and the man who had caused so much suffering would be gone forever. Justice, served swift and final. But then he looked out at the crowd of people who were watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be. He saw children who had never known anything but fear and oppression. He saw men and women who had endured unimaginable hardships, but had somehow maintained their humanity. He saw hope in their eyes, not hope for revenge, but hope for something better. "No," Tobias said, and he let the pistol fall to the ground. "I won't become you." Instead, he turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the power of a man who had finally found his purpose. "My name is Tobias Johnson," he called out. "Not the Hammer, not Master Whitmore's fighter. Tobias Johnson, and I am not your enemy. I never was your enemy. I was your brother who lost his way, and I'm asking, begging for the chance to find it again." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The crowd surged forward, not with violence but with joy. Men who had feared him for years reached out to clasp his hands. Women who had watched him break their sons and husbands embraced him with tears streaming down their faces. Children who had been taught to see him as a monster looked up at him with wonder and acceptance. "What do we do now?" someone called out from the crowd. Tobias looked at Ezekiel, who was binding Master Whitmore's hands with rope that had appeared from somewhere in the crowd. The smaller man met his gaze and nodded toward the north. "Now," Tobias said, his voice strong and clear, "we go home." The pre-dawn hours of that Georgia morning would be remembered for generations as the moment when everything changed at Whitmore Plantation. As the first pale light of sunrise began to creep across the horizon, nearly 200 enslaved people stood in the courtyard that had witnessed so much suffering, preparing for a journey that many had dreamed of, but few had ever dared to believe possible. Ezekiel had revealed himself to be more than just a freedom fighter. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, with connections and safe houses stretching all the way to the Canadian border. The network he represented had been planning something like this for months, waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst to spark a mass escape. "The hardest part," Ezekiel explained to the gathered crowd, "isn't getting away from here. It's staying together and staying alive long enough to reach free soil." They had perhaps 6 hours before Master Whitmore's absence would be noticed by neighboring plantations. 6 hours before the alarm would be raised and the hunt would begin. It wasn't much time to organize nearly 200 people for a journey that would take weeks, but it would have to be enough. Tobias found himself in an unexpected position of leadership. The same physical presence that had made him such an effective enforcer of oppression now made him a natural choice to help organize their escape. But more than that, his transformation had given the others something they had never had before: proof that change was possible, that even the most broken among them could find redemption. "We'll travel in smaller groups," Tobias announced, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "Families stay together, but we spread out along different routes. If one group gets caught, the others keep moving." Ruth stepped forward, her earlier injuries forgotten in the excitement of the moment. "What about supplies, food, water? We can't make it to the next state on empty stomachs." "The plantation storehouse," suggested Moses, pointing toward a large wooden building near the main house. "There's enough dried meat and grain in there to feed us for days." "And weapons," added Samuel, his young face hard with determination. "If they come after us, we need to be able to defend ourselves." Tobias felt a moment of unease at the mention of weapons. Violence had been such a central part of his life for so long that the thought of returning to it, even in self-defense, made his stomach clench. But Ezekiel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes," Ezekiel said quietly, "the only way to preserve life is to be prepared to take it. That doesn't make you the same as them. It makes you someone who values freedom more than safety." As the crowd dispersed to gather supplies and prepare for the journey, Tobias found himself standing alone in the fighting circle where his transformation had begun. The packed earth was still stained with blood, his and Ezekiel's, but somehow it no longer looked like a place of suffering. Instead, it looked like a place where something new had been born. "Having second thoughts?" Ezekiel asked, approaching from behind. "Every second," Tobias admitted. 15 years of doing what I was told, and now I'm supposed to lead people to freedom. What if I make the wrong choice? What if people die because I don't know what I'm doing?" "People have been dying here for years," Ezekiel replied. "At least now they have a chance to die free. That's more than they had yesterday." The truth of those words settled over Tobias like a heavy cloak. Freedom wasn't a guarantee of safety. It was simply the right to choose your own risks, to face danger on your own terms rather than someone else's. As the sun climbed higher, the plantation began to empty in a way that would have been unimaginable just hours before. Groups of 10 to 15 people slipped away into the Georgia wilderness, following routes that Ezekiel had memorized during his months of preparation. Some headed north toward the mountains of Tennessee. Others moved east toward the coast, where ships waited to carry them to northern ports. Still others went west toward territories where the reach of slave catchers was less certain. Tobias led the largest group, nearly 50 people. including many of the families with young children who would need the most protection. Their route would take them through the most dangerous territory, but it was also the most direct path to the network of safe houses that could shelter them during their journey. As they prepared to leave, Tobias took one last look at the plantation that had been his prison for 15 years. The main house stood silent and empty. Master Whitmore and his son had been left tied up in the root cellar, along with Overseer Hayes and the other guards. They would be found eventually, but not for hours yet. "Any regrets?" Ezekiel asked, following Tobias's gaze. "Only one," Tobias replied, "that it took me so long to remember who I was supposed to be." The first day of their journey was the most dangerous. They traveled through dense forests and swampland, staying off the main roads and avoiding any signs of human habitation. The children struggled with the pace, and several of the older people had to be helped along by stronger members of the group. But they kept moving, driven by a shared determination that seemed to grow stronger with each mile they put between themselves and their former prison. That evening, as they made camp in a hidden grove beside a small stream, Tobias found himself sitting beside an old woman named Sarah, who had been on the plantation longer than anyone else. She was perhaps 70 years old, her hair white as cotton, and her hands gnarled from decades of hard labor. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 60 years I've been enslaved. 60 years of watching children born into chains, watching families torn apart, watching good people broken by this evil system. And now..." She trailed off, looking around at the camp where families were sharing their meager rations and children were playing games in the firelight, their laughter echoing through the trees. "Now I get to die free," she finished. "You're not going to die," Tobias said firmly. "We're going to get you to Canada, all of us." Sarah smiled, her weathered face creasing with genuine joy. "Child, I've lived longer than I ever expected to. If I die tomorrow, I'll die knowing that I spent my last days as a free woman. That's more than I ever dared to hope for." Her words stayed with Tobias as he made his rounds through the camp, checking on the sentries and making sure everyone had what they needed for the night. The responsibility was overwhelming, 50 lives depending on his decisions, his leadership, his ability to get them safely to freedom. But as he looked at the faces around him, faces that showed exhaustion and fear, yes, but also hope and determination, he realized that he wasn't carrying this burden alone. Every person in the group was contributing something: knowledge of the local terrain, skills in hunting and foraging, experience in avoiding detection. They were no longer just a collection of escaped slaves. They were a community, a family bound together by shared purpose and mutual dependence. The second day brought their first real test. As they approached a river crossing that Ezekiel had marked as safe, they spotted a group of mounted men on the far bank, slave catchers armed and clearly searching for something. "How many?" Tobias whispered to Samuel, who had climbed a tree to get a better view. 6 men, Samuel replied, "all armed. They've got dogs with them." The dogs were the real problem. Even if they could avoid the men, the animals would pick up their scent and track them relentlessly. They needed a way to throw off the pursuit, without engaging in a direct confrontation that could get people killed. "The river," suggested Ruth. "If we cross upstream and then double back through the water, it might confuse the scent trail." "Too risky," Moses countered. "Half these children can't swim. We lose someone in that current, and it's all for nothing." Tobias studied the situation, his mind racing through possibilities. Then he remembered something from his childhood, a trick his father had taught him for hunting rabbits. "We split up," he said finally. "Most of the group goes upstream like Ruth suggested, but they don't cross. They follow the bank for a mile, then circle back through the forest. Meanwhile, a small group, volunteers only, crosses here and leads the dogs away from the main group." "That's suicide," Ezekiel protested. "Whoever crosses here will be caught for certain." "Not if they're fast enough," Tobias replied, "and not if they know the terrain better than the hunters do." In the end, 5 volunteers stepped forward. Tobias himself, Samuel, Ruth, Moses, and a young woman named Grace, who had grown up in these woods before being sold to the plantation. They would cross the river, leave an obvious trail for the dogs to follow, then use their knowledge of the local terrain to evade capture, while the main group escaped to safety. The plan worked better than anyone had dared to hope. The slave catchers took the bait, following the false trail deeper into the wilderness, while the main group slipped away undetected. By the time the hunters realized they had been deceived, their quarry was miles away and moving fast. But the close call had shaken everyone. They were still deep in slave territory, still hundreds of miles from safety, and now they knew that organized pursuit was already underway. "We need to move faster," Ezekiel said as they regrouped that evening. "Word is spreading. Every day we stay in Georgia makes it more likely that we'll be caught." "The children can't go any faster," protested a woman named Hannah, whose 6-year-old son had been struggling to keep up. "And some of the older folks are already at their limit." It was an impossible dilemma. Push too hard, and they would lose people to exhaustion and injury. Move too slowly, and they would all be recaptured or killed. Tobias found himself wishing for the simplicity of his old life, when his only responsibility had been to follow orders and survive another day. But then he looked around at the faces watching him, faces full of trust and hope, and he realized that this was what freedom really meant. Not the absence of responsibility, but the right to choose which responsibilities to accept. These people were depending on him not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because they believed in him. "We keep going," he said finally. "We help each other, we watch out for each other, and we don't leave anyone behind. That's what family does." The word hung in the air for a moment before being taken up by others around the camp. Family. Not the family they had been born into, or the family that had been torn apart by slavery, but the family they had chosen to become. Over the following days, that sense of chosen family became their greatest strength. When little Hannah's son could no longer walk, the men took turns carrying him. When old Sarah collapsed from exhaustion, the women formed a circle around her and helped her rest until she could continue. When their food ran low, everyone shared what they had without complaint. They faced river crossings and mountain passes, thunderstorms and scorching heat. They evaded slave catchers and hostile locals, wild animals and treacherous terrain. But they kept moving, kept supporting each other, kept believing in the possibility of freedom. And slowly, mile by mile, day by day, they began to leave the world of slavery behind. 3 weeks into their journey, they reached their first major safe house, a farm in eastern Tennessee owned by a Quaker family who had been helping escaped slaves for years. The sight of white people who welcomed them with open arms and genuine kindness was almost too much to believe after a lifetime of oppression. "You're safe here," the farmer's wife assured them as she ladled hot soup into bowls. "Rest, eat, recover your strength. The next leg of your journey will be easier." That night, as Tobias sat by the fire listening to the sound of children laughing and adults sharing stories of their lives before slavery, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Peace. Ezekiel found him there, staring into the flames with the expression of quiet contentment. "Thinking about Maria?" Ezekiel asked. "Among other things," Tobias replied, "thinking about how strange it is to be happy. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like." "You'll see her soon," Ezekiel promised. "Philadelphia is only 2 weeks away if we keep up this pace." "And after that?" "After that, you get to decide. That's what freedom means, the right to choose your own path." Tobias nodded, understanding for the first time what Ezekiel meant. For his entire life, his path had been chosen for him, first by the circumstances of his birth, then by the cruelty of his masters. But now, for the first time, he would get to decide who he wanted to be and how he wanted to live. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. 2 weeks later, as they crested a hill outside Philadelphia and saw the city spread out before them in the morning sunlight, Tobias felt tears streaming down his face. Not tears of sadness or pain, but tears of joy and gratitude and overwhelming relief. They had made it, all of them. 50 people who had started this journey as property had arrived as free human beings, ready to begin new lives in a world where their choices were their own. And somewhere in that city, a woman named Maria was waiting for a man named Tobias Johnson to come home, 5 years later. The small schoolhouse in Philadelphia buzzed with the excited chatter of children learning their letters. At the front of the room, A tall, powerfully built man with gentle eyes pointed to words written on a slate board, his voice patient and encouraging as he helped his students sound out each syllable. "Very good, Thomas," Tobias Johnson said to a 7-year-old boy who had just successfully read his first complete sentence. "Now, who can tell me what this word means?" A dozen small hands shot into the air, each child eager to demonstrate their growing knowledge. These were the children of freedom, some born free, others born into slavery, but liberated by the Underground Railroad. All of them were learning to read and write, preparing for lives that their parents could never have imagined. At the back of the classroom, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair watched the lesson with obvious pride. Maria Freeman, she had taken Tobias's surname when they married 3 years ago, still worked as a seamstress, but she also helped run the school that she and Tobias had founded for the children of escaped slaves. The school was housed in a building that had once been a warehouse, purchased with money donated by abolitionists, and furnished with desks built by the fathers of the students. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but inside it was filled with something precious, hope for the future. "Mr. Johnson," called out a girl named Sarah, named after the old woman who had made the journey from Georgia but had died peacefully in her sleep just 6 months after reaching freedom. "Will you tell us the story again? About the fight?" Tobias smiled, recognizing the request that came at least once a week. The children never tired of hearing about that night at Whitmore Plantation, about the fight that had changed everything. But Tobias had learned to tell it in a way that emphasized not the violence, but the courage to remember who you really are, even when the world tries to make you forget. "Well," he began, settling into his chair at the front of the room. It was a hot summer night in Georgia, and there was a man who had forgotten his own name. As he spoke, Tobias's eyes found Maria's across the room. She smiled at him, the same smile that had sustained him through 15 years of darkness, and had welcomed him home when he finally found his way back to the light. The story he told the children was true, but it wasn't complete. He didn't tell them about the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the middle of the night, or about the guilt that occasionally overwhelmed him when he thought about all the people he had hurt during his years as the Hammer. He didn't tell them about the letters that still arrived from the South, carrying news of friends who hadn't made it to freedom, or about the former slaves who sometimes looked at him with suspicion, remembering what he had been before he remembered who he was. But he also didn't tell them about the profound joy he felt every morning when he woke up next to the woman he loved, or about the satisfaction of teaching children to read words that would help them navigate a world where they were free to make their own choices. He didn't tell them about the letters he received from other former slaves who had found their own paths to redemption, or about the Underground Railroad conductors who still sought his advice on helping people escape from bondage. After the children had gone home for the day, Tobias and Maria walked hand in hand through the streets of Philadelphia. The city had become a beacon for escaped slaves, a place where former property could become citizens, where people who had been denied education could learn to read and write, where families torn apart by slavery could be reunited. "Ezekiel sent another letter," Maria said, as they paused outside a small cafe where they often shared their evening meal. "He's in Canada now, helping to establish schools there for the people who've made it all the way to freedom." Tobias nodded, unsurprised. Ezekiel had never been able to stay in one place for long. The man who had reminded Tobias of his true identity had continued his work with the Underground Railroad, always moving, always helping others find their way to freedom. They corresponded regularly, and Ezekiel's letters were filled with stories of successful escapes and new lives begun in freedom. "He says Ruth and Moses are doing well," Maria continued. "Ruth is working as a midwife and Moses has started a small farm. They're both married now with children of their own." The news filled Tobias with warmth. So many of the people who had made that dangerous journey from Georgia had gone on to build meaningful lives in freedom. Some had moved to Canada, others had settled in northern cities, and a few had even joined the growing movement to abolish slavery entirely. But not all the news was good. Samuel, the young man who had shown such courage during their escape, had been killed 2 years ago while helping other slaves escape from a plantation in Virginia. Hannah's son, the little boy who had been carried when he could no longer walk, had died of pneumonia during his first winter in freedom. Old Sarah had lived just long enough to see her great-grandchildren born free before passing peacefully in her sleep. Freedom, Tobias had learned, was not a destination but a journey, one that came with its own risks and sorrows, but also with the precious gift of choice. The choice to love whom you wanted to love, to work at something that gave your life meaning, to raise children who would never know the weight of chains. As they sat in the cafe sharing a simple meal of bread and soup, Tobias reflected on how different his life had become. 5 years ago, he had been a man without a name, without hope, without any purpose beyond serving his master's twisted entertainment. Now he was a teacher, a husband, a member of a community that valued his contributions and respected his journey. "Do you ever regret it?" Maria asked quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "Giving up the security of your old life?" It was a question she had asked before, and one that Tobias understood completely. There had been a certain terrible simplicity to his life as the hammer. His choices had been made for him, his path predetermined. He had been fed regularly, housed adequately, and protected from many of the uncertainties that came with freedom. "Never," he said without hesitation, "not for a single moment." And it was true. Even on the hardest days, when money was tight, when former slaves looked at him with suspicion, when the nightmares came, he had never once wished to return to the false security of slavery. Because he had learned something that night in the fighting circle that had changed everything. A man could survive without freedom, but he couldn't truly live without it. After dinner, they walked to the small cemetery where many of the escaped slaves who had died in freedom were buried. Tobias knelt beside a simple headstone marked Sarah Freeman. The old woman had asked to be buried with their chosen family name, and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. "She would be proud of what you've accomplished," Maria said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "What we've accomplished," Tobias corrected. "None of this would have been possible without all of you." As they walked home through the gas-lit streets of Philadelphia, Tobias thought about the circle that had brought him to this moment. It had begun with violence and oppression, with a young man being forced to become something he was never meant to be. But it had ended with love and purpose, with that same man choosing to become someone who helped others find their own paths to freedom. The schoolhouse they had built was, in its own way, another kind of fighting circle, but this one was dedicated to building people up rather than tearing them down. Instead of teaching children to submit to oppression, it taught them to think for themselves, to dream of futures that their parents could never have imagined. That night, as Tobias lay in bed beside the woman he loved, listening to the sounds of a free city settling into sleep around them, he thought about all the people who had played a role in his transformation. Ezekiel, who had risked everything to remind him of who he really was. Ruth and Moses and Samuel and all the others who had shown him what courage looked like. Maria, who had never stopped believing that the man she loved was still somewhere inside the weapon he had been forced to become. But most of all, he thought about the children in his classroom. Children who would grow up free, who would never know the weight of chains or the crushing despair of hopelessness. They were the real victory, the true measure of how far they had all come. As sleep began to claim him, Tobias whispered a prayer of gratitude for the night that had changed everything, for the fight that had reminded him of his name, for the journey that had brought him home, and for the chance to spend the rest of his life helping others find their own paths to freedom. In his dreams, he was back in the fighting circle, but this time he wasn't alone. Ezekiel was there, and Maria, and all the children from his school, and all the people who had made the journey from slavery to freedom. They stood together in the flickering lantern light, not as opponents but as family, not as property, but as human beings who had chosen to remember their own names. And in that dream, the circle was no longer a place of violence and oppression, but a place of hope and possibility, a place where broken people could be made whole, where the lost could find their way home, and where the simple act of remembering who you really are could change the world. The fight was over, the journey was complete, and Tobias Johnson, teacher, husband, free man, was finally, truly home. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others who need to hear about the power of redemption and the unbreakable human spirit. Remember, No matter how lost you may feel, it's never too late to remember who you really are and choose who you want to become. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right. Keep believing in the possibility of change, and never forget that freedom is not just the absence of chains. It's the courage to choose your own path. This story is dedicated to all those who fought for freedom, who chose courage over comfort, and who never stopped believing that a better world was possible. Their legacy lives on in every act of kindness, every stand against injustice, and every choice to see the humanity in others, no matter how different their journey may have been.